Hello and welcome. This is a lecture review for the William Stallings Effective Cybersecurity First Edition book. Again, this is a lecture review using the material offered by the publisher Pearson VUE. All copyrights belong to them. This is for educational purposes only. Again, the textbook is Stallings Effective Cybersecurity, a guide to using best practices and standards, first edition, done through Pearson VUE Education, ISBN number 13 97801 3477 2806. So again, copyright belongs to the author and publisher. I am just doing lecture reviews on the PowerPoints for each of the individual chapters. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump on in. Chapter 1. So, the purpose of this book is to provide security managers, security implementers with a comprehensive understanding of the technologies, operational procedures, and the management practices needed for effective cybersecurity. To that end, this book makes extensive use of standards, best practices documents, and have a broad support and are used to guide, in many cases, the appropriate approaches for cybersecurity implementation. Although these documents represent a collective wisdom of numerous organizations, security experts, and several different frameworks, they are insufficient by themselves. The focus of these documents are mainly used as a checklist type function. The organization are going to be unique. So you cannot always go, oh, well, this is what we need to implement. You need to ask yourself, what do we need to implement? And how do we do it? So we will provide detailed explanations of technologies, procedures, best practices. You have to take it with a grain of salt and apply it to your specific situation. Not all situations are the same, so there is no one-size-fits-all type shoe. So we're going to be focusing on things like cyberspace, cybersecurity, and information security management dealing with cybersecurity. So the first one is defining cyberspace. So it is useful at the start to have a working definition. So for cyberspace and cybersecurity, a useful definition of cyberspace comes from the National Research Council publication at the Nexus of Cybersecurity and Public Policy. Claire 14. Cyberspace consists of artifacts based on or dependent on the computer or system or communication technologies. The information that these artifacts use, store, handle, or process, as well as the interconnections among various elements. That's essentially what our cyberspace is going to be. Our cybersecurity, based off of the International Telecommunications Union Standard, ITU X1205. Cybersecurity is the collection of tools, policies, procedures, guidelines, security concepts, security safeguards, risk management approaches, actions, trainings, best practices, assurance technologies that are used to protect the cyberspace environment of an organization, assets, users, and data. data can also be an asset, but I mean they normally separate them. Organizations and the user assets and regular data assets connect computing devices, whether it's personal or infrastructure, applications, services, our telecom systems, our data communication systems, and the totality of the transmitted or received data or stored information in the cyberspace arena. Cybersecurity strives to ensure that a certain level of attainment and maintenance of security procedures, controls, and properties of the organization are staying relevant and minimizing security risk to those assets in the cyberspace environment and realm. The general security objective comprised the following: availability, integrity, confidentiality, that's your CIA, and may include other things like authenticity and non-repudiation. Again, CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability, and also including things like authenticity and non-repudiation. So that means let's talk about what is security. What is in terms of information? So there are two main elements for security that we need to really make sure we understand: information security, network security. Information or data security preserves the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data, the CIA. It additionally provides a certain level of protection, the properties such as the accountability, non-repudiation, the reliability, and the authenticity of that data, whether it be processed, in storage, or in motion. Network security, protection of the network and network services or infrastructure, as well as all of the services running the network services from unauthorized modification, destruction, disclosure. Basically making sure the network is running correctly and only those that are authorized are actually accessing those resources. Cybersecurity will encompass information protection and information security with respect to the electronic information and data and network level of security. Information security also is concerned with the physical aspect of information. However, in practice, the term cybersecurity and information security are often used interchangeably. So normally we're looking at security, and it could be used either or. Other important terms we need to discuss are risk and assets. Risk is basically likelihood. What is the likelihood of something happening? The textbook likes to refer to it as the measure and extent to which the entity is threatened by a potential circumstance or event, typically in the function of the adverse impact or likelihood of an occurrence. Asset could be pretty much anything: data, information, system, services, any tangible component to a network. And there are some intangible assets like intellectual property or copyright material that's not physical, but is definitely still classified as an asset. Here we have our 5 major pillars of information security: confidentiality, integrity, availability. Those are the big 3 that builds our CIA. We also have authenticity and accountability. Those are 2 new ones, along with things like non-repudiation. Non-repudiation is built through authenticity and accountability. So even though it's not listed, it is definitely still here. Availability means basically systems are up when those that need the systems to be up are actually up. Integrity is, again, nothing's been modified, destroyed, or lost by accident or on purpose. Authenticity is the property of being genuine. Non-repudiation is assurance that the sender of the information has provided proof of delivery, and the recipient is provided with proof of the sender's identity. Confidentiality is basically only is being disclosed to those that are absolutely necessary, and accountability is just that. It's the property of the system or system resources ensuring a certain level of uniqueness, thus being held accountable. So there are dilemmas, there are problems. The scale and complexity of the cyberspace, new types of assets, Internet of Things, industrial Internet of Things, cloud computing, wireless, users, the scale and complexity it grows. So there's challenges. There's also the nature of threats. Organizational assets in the cyberspace are always under attack and always evolving. So the variety of legitimate actors, including businesses and governments, that's just their target. So that becomes a concern, that becomes an issue. Users' need versus implementation of protection. Basically, usability versus protection and privacy. As you get more towards securing the devices, you get away from usability. So it's a double-edged sword. You can make something really secure, but then users can't use it, so you want a balance between the two. Lastly, difficulty estimating cost and benefits. This is a challenge. This is not, overnight. Like, this takes some time to figure out which is the appropriate costs and recognize that it may be completely different by the following day. Threats and vulnerabilities. A threat is a potential for violation of security that exists based off of circumstance, capability, action, or an event that can breach the protection. Essentially, a threat can cause harm. A vulnerability is a flaw or weakness in something. In design, in implementation, in operation, in management, in policy, and procedure. It's something that can be exploited to cause some damage. The value of the standards and best practices is so that you can learn from experience. There's a number of organizations nationally. That will be the National Institute for Standard and Technology, or NIST. There's also the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. There's the International Organizations for Standard, ISO. There's the Internet Society, ISOC. There's a plethora of professional and industry groups as well. There are other guidelines for things like good practices or best practices offered by the ISF or Information Security Forums. These are hundreds of pages of really good reading and levels of protection, but it's a lot and it's overwhelming. There's also other formalized groups like ISACA or PCI DSS. So there are compliance groups out there as well as industry setting guidelines by these groups. There's standards through NIST that are called FIP, Federal Information Processing Standards. There are special publications under NIST. So there's a lot under these standards. And again, the goal here is just for us to get a basic level of understanding so we can slowly start to explore the different levels and different types of sources. The big thing here to understand is this is not an exhaustive list. This is a very high overview. This is just some of them. While NIST is very common in the US, ITU and ISO are both international level standards. You're going to have to look at what organization you have, and that in turn will let you know what to do. Effective cybersecurity is very difficult, and any attempt to develop ad hoc, grow your own type approaches in cybersecurity typically fail. The good news is that's why we have some of these standards. These standards are put together specifically because a lot of the frameworks that came before them sucked or just didn't make it off the ground. Or in some regards, some have actually been created because of issues. Working with PCI, for example, the industry recognized there was a need for protection of payment card data, credit card, debit card data. So they created their own standard, and then they formalized it and required vendors and merchants that use credit card services to actually meet their new compliance. So there are bodies out there that are a little bit more proactive. So keep that in mind. Now, does everyone need to meet them? No. You have to look at what regulations does your organization need to meet, and then you meet the requirements. Here we have a good source and title. So NIST came about earlier than 2017, but some of them are the more recent ones are things like the critical infrastructure for cybersecurity. ISACA has COBIT 5. PCI has the payment card DSS or Data Security Standards requirements. There's the Information Security Forum that develops standards for good practices. ISO has the ISO 27000, ISO 27001, and ISO 27002 for implementation of security practices. 27002 is the Code of Practice of Information Security Controls. This is the control portion. 27001 is more of the high-level policy procedural component, with 002 being the more control-focused portion. So again, you have to look at what's realistic for my organization. What does my organization have to meet? That then drives whatever level of protection we're going to be looking at. So let's look at a few of these. Let's look at the Standards for Good Practices, SGP. The ISF is an independent not-for-profit, not non-profit, but it's a not-for-profit association for leading organizations around the world. ISF members fund and cooperate for research for cybersecurity. It's dedicated to invest, clarifying, and resolving issues within cybersecurity. The most significant activity of the ISF is an ongoing development of Standards of Good Practice. Standard Good Practice, SGP. These documents are business-focused comprehensive guides for identifying and managing risk in cybersecurity and their role in supply chain. The SGP is based on research projects, input from members, analysis of leading standards, reviewed, reprocessed, went through information security assurance again, and also reviewed for risk management, and then again reviewed again. That way they could develop some starting best practices for certain areas. And again, SGP focuses on the organization and their supply chain, but there are some good starting points for protection. So let's look at the ISF and the SGP in a diagram form. So again, we're looking at projects, experience, national standards, metrics, and benchmarks. We put them together. That forms the management team. The management team then defines the SGP. While the SGP was first released in 1996, ISF also released things like the Information Risk Analysis Methodology, and part of these tools also help build things like COBIT 5, ISO 27002. So there's analysis and integration tools for regulatory requirements. It could be SOX, it could be PCI DSS. All of the standards are listed and incorporated into the SGP. So the SGP is taking the best out of the majority of the different compliances to ensure a better benchmark of protection. Security policies are just that. Policies for security. A policy is a set of rules and practice that specify or regulate how a system, a person, an organization, an asset provides security services, as well as protecting sensitive information, as well as critical resources, whether it be system, personnel, or infrastructure. SGP is of interest to the following individuals: the CSO, the information manager, the business managers, technical managers, auditors, service providers, and procurement and vendor management teams. All of these individuals deal with security on one level or another. Vendor management, auditors, the technical leads, the business managers, all of these are positions that directly deal with the impact of the business. So all of these could be stakeholders of that business. Best practices are typically used by anyone that's going to be dealing with protection or security. So here are a standard list of protections and categorized areas. So we have things like the security governance, that's the approaches and components. We have risk assessment, that's going to be the framework and processes. We have our security management, that will be policy management and security management. We have people management, that's HR security, and that could also be security awareness and security education. We have informational management, and that could be information classification and privacy, as well as protection. We have physical management or physical asset management, and that could be mobile devices and computer management. We have system development or software development, that could be the SDLC and software development management. We have our business application management, that could be applications for corporate business or end users, and so forth. Again, the SGP is organized into 17 main categories, each broken down into 2-ish areas of protection. System access is access management and customer access. System management is system configuration and maintenance. Networking communication is network management and electronic communication. Supply chain management is external supply management and cloud computing. Don't know how those go together, but it is what it is. Technical security management or security solutions, controls, and cryptography. Threat and incident management, that's resilience and security incident management. We have the local environment management. That will be local environment and physical environment security. We have business continuity, that's the framework and process. And lastly is security monitoring and improvement. That's auditing and performance. So those are the main 17 categories and the main groups for the SGP to be broken down into. Each area is further broken down into a number of topics or activities for a total of 132 topics or activities. Each of the 132 topics will address good practice controls relevant to a particular activity or task from an information security perspective. So you can see that this expands quickly. For planning for cybersecurity, you're going to be looking at risk management, governance. That then drills down into managing functions, and that will be people management, physical assets, system development. Again, this is the SGP in a giant loop. And then after we go through these main categories, we have our security assets, business continuity, and security monitoring and improvement, and then we repeat the cycle again. So we have the planning for security, managing of security, and security assessment. And then we loop and we repeat. So that is for our SGP. Next, we have our ISO. Our ISO, founded in 1946, it is a member of ANSI, the American National Standards Institution. It has more than several thousand standards, over 12,000 standards. It is well known for the ISO 27000 block of protection. ISO is the International Standards Organization. They standardize deals with the Open System Interconnection, OSI, communication protocols. So if you've done networking, you're looking at the OSI, which was developed in conjunction with ISO. Have to love that because it's ISO, OSI. So it's just the same acronym but backwards. There are a lot of protection and nuances with the international standards. They've been around for a while, and again, they provide a simple framework for people to be able to follow. We also have the ISO or IEC, which is the International Electronics Technicians Commission. It's ISO, but more geared towards Electronic Technical Commission. It's a slightly different group. They develop standards jointly with ISO, focusing in networking, communication, and protection. They're primarily concerned with electronics and electronic engineering standards. In the area of information technology, the IEC emphasis is on hardware, where the ISO is more focused on software. The two jointly formed a committee, JTC, in 1997. And this committee has been responsible for developing and documenting what essentially has been the ISO-based standards of recently. There are a number of standards that they've done together. The ISO and IEC have developed a growing family of standards, part of the 27000 series, that deal with information security management systems. These basically consist of the policies, procedures, and guidelines associated with resources and activities collectively managed by an organization, specifically focusing in security. The ISMS have an overview, have requirements, have guidelines, and sector-specific requirements. So the overview is 27000. The requirements, and again, high-level requirements, are 27001, and there are sector-specific ones in the 27009. Most companies that go this route focus on 27001 and 27002. 27001, high-level policies, procedures, it's the overall requirements. The implementation and the guidelines are 27002, and that is more nitty-gritty, more in the weeds, and it's more focused. There are other variations like 27007 for auditing or governance, which is 27014. If there's a supplier relationship, that'd be 27036, and so forth. Again, a huge part of this is just recognizing there are international standards for protection. Not willy-nilly, they're structured. There are there are security controls that allow you to implement appropriate protections based off of the current management, operational, and technical controls, including countermeasures that your organization uses to ensure CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of technology-based assets. There are certifications that ensure you're actually meeting these standards. The provision by an independent body for written assurance, basically a certificate, that the product, services, or systems in question meet a specific requirement. Basically, this is just the compliance certification. So if you are using payment cards and you have to meet PCI DSS, then you have to meet their requirements and then get certified that you've met their requirements. Here we have the ISO 27001. We have Section 4, context of the organization, leadership, planning, support, operations, performance evaluations, and improvement. So these are just some of the main categories. Understanding the organization, its context, its expectations, its long-term goals, its short-term goals, its alignment within its technology scope, their management protection system. For leadership, it's the leadership and commitment, policies, procedures, roles, responsibilities, separation of duties. For planning, it's actions to address risk and opportunities, and again, aligning information security objectives to the planning stage so that they can also be achievable. Support is again resources, competency, communication, awareness, documentation. 8 is operation, that's planning and control, and also dealing with risk and risk treatment. 9 is about actually developing the appropriate metrics and auditing. And 10 is improvement. You always have to worry about improvement. We have additional for the ISO 27002. And again, these are going to be more focused controls. So it's not just going to be, do you have a firewall? It's going to be more in-depth. Things like access control, they actually drill into access management, user responsibilities, system application controls, cryptography details, operational security, equipment, secure assets, secure areas, compliance, information security, incident management, and again, how to handle these. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just a high overview. 27002 is in depth, and this is not a early cert that most people review or look at. I'm working with several large casinos, and globally, they've been trying to hire an ISO 27001 professional, and they're not able to because these are some beefy certifications that take a lot of time to master. Here we have, again, 27001. This is the alignment to the SGP. So you can see the alignment of, let's say, 8.1, operational plans and controls. That maps to a security management category within the SGP. And when we look at, again, mapping ISO 27002, the same thing. There is a mapping between controls of operation of software, 12.5. There's a mapping to the SGP. So the SGP takes the major certifications and map the major certifications back to SGP for better documentation. Here we have a breakdown of SGP threats and incident management categories. So again, we have the topics, and topics can either be a fundamental or a specialty topic, and they're broken down into main topic areas. So the area might be cybersecurity resilience. Then underneath that might be topics like vulnerability, event logging, event management, threat intelligence, cyber attack protection. Those are the main topics for cybersecurity resilience. And then you can list number of subtopics, and then you can also list, are they fundamental or are they specialty topics? Threat intelligence, it has a number of subtopics, 10, and it is a specialty topic. Cyber attack protection, again, specialty topic. Security event management, again, special topic. So you can see that there's a structure to SGP to ensure a certain level of protection. Here we have our NIST framework, and our NIST is a federal organization that set the standards in the U.S. You can also have federal standards underneath NIST. That would be the NIST FIPS, or Federal Information Processing Standard, with a special publication, because the special publication does have a worldwide impact when dealing with the U.S. In the area of information security, the NIST Computer Security Resource Center, CSRC, is the source of a vast collection of documentation and documents widely used in the security protection or the security realm to ensure protection. It's a lot of detail, a lot of documentation. At least in the U.S., the federal agencies that deal with security, they follow the NIST standards. And for anyone dealing with federal organizations, they normally require FIPS. So again, FIPS is the Federal Information Processing Standard, and the SP is the special publication. Because again, these are used predominantly in the US, but several of them are also used internationally. They are the guidelines, they're the structure, they're the framework. They're not one and done. It is the structure of how to actually do something. So here we have the framework components. We have the implementation tiers, the partial, the risk-informed, the repeatable, and the adaptiveness. Then we have the core functions, categories and subcategories, and these collectively help build a profile for implementation. Profiles represent the outcomes based on a business need that an organization has selected from the framework. Again, they're not alone, it's part of the framework. And part of that is also going to be dealing with the core categories and subcategories. The core consists of functions and categories and subcategories. They provide a set of cybersecurity activities and desired outcomes and applicable references that are common across most key critical infrastructure sectors. That's how we apply the NIST framework to different organizations. Here we have the security framework functions and categories. Identify, protect, detect. Let's repeat that. Identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And they then also define them in the individual categories. Again, they are very structured, they're very hierarchy, and you start off at the top and you slowly whittle your way down. That is the normal way. There are 23 categories and 106 subcategories. The 5 main functions provide a high-level view of the elements that compose of risk management to the organization. All of them fall within these 5 main functions. Here we have the cybersecurity framework implementation tier. So tier 1, 2, 3, and 4. Partial, risk-informed, repeatable, adaptive. The partial is just that. It's limited awareness. They only have a very small or partial list of assets and resources and things like that. Our risk-informed is going to be just that. They have at least a sense of what risk they are combating. Repeatable is going to be organizational wide, and are they able to repeat the policies, procedures, and the guidelines? The adaptiveness is how you modify, how you grow, how you adapt to the changing of threats and threat landscape. So let's talk countermeasures. A countermeasure are actions or devices, procedures, guidelines, techniques, anything to eliminate or prevent an attack or threat from occurring. You basically want to minimize the harm so that if something is discovered, well, you've minimized the possible harm and you've taken the appropriate corrective actions to mitigate that. Again, countermeasure, you can think of corrective actions to prevent something. NIST has security documents like the NIST SP 853. That is the security and privacy controls for federal information systems and organizations, and this is one of the more important documents. This will list the technical safeguards and countermeasures prescribed by the appropriate bodies. This also deals with the U.S. government systems and the equal applicable to IT systems for most organizations. But again, it was more geared towards federal government, so you have to keep that in mind. The state of the practice security controls and control enhancements have been integrated into the latest version, 2013. So again, 10 years old. And as they've developed, they implement new controls and new protections, and they get these updated. Now, they don't get updated as frequently as they should, because security definitely is a quickly adapting, quickly changing environment that our standards don't always go hand in hand with. And again, this is just one of the NIST standards. There's lots of them. You just have to figure out which ones are most appropriate for your organization, and those are the ones that you go after. Again, there is no one size fits all. You look at the appropriate requirements and appropriate standards, and from there, you select whichever areas are appropriate or applicable to your situation and within your context. Again, we have FIPS 200, we have SP 800 100, and that's the Information Security Handbook, normally for managers. We have the SP 855, which is Performance Measurement Guidelines, basically metrics. 827, that's the engineering principles. We have 812, that's basically the introduction to information security. We have 800-144, that's guidelines for security and privacy protection. You notice, I don't see SP for risk, or risk management, or risk assessment. They have one. They actually have NIST's 800 series for all of the common protections. So again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is a partial list of some of the major ones, but not an exhaustive list. Next, let's define an attack. This is any kind of malicious activity that attempts to collect, disrupt, deny, degrade, destroy, prevent, access unauthorized resources, whether it's data, a computer, a system, a network node, whatever it may be. There's also other controls, commonly referred to as the critical security controls, or CIS, or what a lot of people call the SANS Top 20. That is because they identified the appropriate security techniques, and they have built out the critical security controls for effective cybersecurity. It focuses on the fundamentals and valuable actions for the enterprise. It's not simply a list of controls, but what to do, how to harden, how to ensure protection, and metrics that make sure you know how to measure them correctly. Here are the top 20. They are broken into three main categories: basic, foundational, organizational. And the basic ones are things like maintenance, secure configuration, controlling access to admin, vulnerability assessment and management, hardware assets, inventory. That's basic. For the foundation, that is protection of web and email, limitation of network services, recovery, securing configuration of devices and firewalls, boundary defense, data protection, controlled access, layered protection is part of that, wireless, account management and account controls, and monitoring. That's the foundation sections. For the operational, that's implementation of awareness, application software security, incident response, pen testing, and offensive-based security. Again, these 20 controls go pretty deep when you actually review the critical security controls, and they walk you through what each control is and how to use them. That's the huge takeaway from the top 20, is how to actually implement them and how to test them. All right, so within those critical security controls, each control has to have the following: a description of the importance of the control, why it's there, a chart of the specific actions called subcontrols, procedures and tools for implementation and automation, and sample entry relationship diagrams that show the components of implementation. Again, oftentimes it could be called the CIS, critical security controls, SANS Top 20, but essentially these are the controls put together to ensure a base level of protection and security. And they can walk you through like hardening of an operating system. They got you covered. As long as you actually go through and do the implementation of controls, then you actually drastically improve your protection. Going back to COBIT 5, COBIT 5 is the fifth version of COBIT. COBIT is the control objective for businesses and related technologies. COBIT. In reality, basically a bunch of financial firms collapsed and they were not as transparent as they said they were, so for protection we got the COBIT framework. It's a set of documents published by ISACA, which is an independent, non-profit global association engaged in the development and adoption and use of globally accepted industry-leading knowledge and practices for information system. COBIT 5 First, the fifth version of the set of documents. It's intended to be a comprehensive framework covering everything within the compliance and management of enterprise of IT-based resources. If we were looking at what compliance to do, ISO 27001 would be last. COBIT would be second to last. If you're a financial institution, that's totally different, because there are some organizations that have a requirement to meet COBIT. Not all of them, so you have to pay attention to which organizations have to meet which levels of compliance. Here we have a breakdown of COBIT 5 functions. We have the policies and the scope. So under policies, we could have things like business continuity. For the scope, that's your DRP, that's your training, that's your testing, that's your BIAs, and so forth. So here we just have a breakdown of the policies and what actions should happen underneath those policies. Vendor management, that's contract management, that's understanding information security, terms and conditions for working with vendors. Communication and operational management, that could be architect and SLAs. For compliance, that could be assessment repositories, development metrics, security metrics, and so forth. COBIT 5 also provides a usual organization for the techniques used for achieving effective security. 5 main areas, and it's normally 1 main area for governance, and then 4 additional areas for management of enterprise. So evaluate, direct, monitoring, that's governance, 5 processes. Outside of that, we have management of enterprise. The first one is align, plan, and organize. There's 13 processes. Second subcategory, build, acquire, and implement. That's 10 processes. The next subcategory, deliver, service, support. That's 6 processes. And then the last one is monitor, evaluate, and assess. That's 3 processes. So you'll notice as we move down the list, we've gotten shorter and shorter. The big ones are evaluate, direct, monitoring, align, plan, align, and organize, build, acquire, implement. Those are the 3 main key areas within COBIT. There's also other standards like the PCI DSS or Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. They dictate what you're allowed to do with credit card data, how you have to secure it, how do you have to protect it, and eventually, if you fail to follow their compliance requirements, they could actually pull your ability to process credit cards, because PCI is Payment Card Industry. That's credit cards and debit cards. So PCI could void a company's ability to process credit cards if the security mechanisms are not there. What's interesting is most people don't even realize PCI, they control their ability for the merchants to process credit cards. They can tell you flat out, no. If the data card environment, CDE, is compromised or is not protected, we don't trust that account to process credit cards. So a location could have their merchant pull their ability to process credit cards, because everyone assumes, everyone does it, but there are standards set aside. So if you do not meet certain levels of requirement of protection, then you're not deemed secure enough to process credit cards. Some key areas are like building and maintaining a secure network, protecting card data with encryption, maintain vulnerability management, implement strong access controls, regular monitor and test the network, maintain policies. You'll notice a lot of these are not overly technical. They're very high level, but then there are sub-requirements. For example, there is sub-requirement 8.1.2. That is identify and authenticate access to system components. 8.1.2 is control additional, deletion, modifications of user IDs, credential, and other identifying objects. So there are subcategories, and sub-requirements that then give you more specific, hey, are you doing this? Are you doing that? To ensure a certain level of protection. Here we have a ITU secure document, and it defines what ITU is, members, the charter, and the objectives. Here we have the ITU recommendations. So that will be the requirements, the architecture, the management, the roles of the directors, identity management, and telebiotics, and examples of the approaches. So they provide you a general structure, so you're not having to do a lot of this on the fly. It makes it easier to manage and easier to implement because of the organization. This is following on the previous page, securing network infrastructure, some specific approaches for network security, cybersecurity incident response, application security, countering common network threats, and security aspect for cloud computing. And as they grow, they adjust and add. Here is the general cybersecurity management process system. Again, we have an ecosystem of best practices and standards. And in the center, we have our update, improve, plan, select, implement, deploy, audit, measure, rinse, repeat. And that allows us to always be growing and always checking. And on the outer areas, we have our lesser or sub portions, continual monitoring, continual testing, continual deployment, development, optimizing feedback, and so forth. Here we have the cybersecurity information and decision flow within an organization. So they can kind of put the different levels, the executive level and the operational and business level, and you can see kind of who's responsible for what. All right, so that was a brief overview of what is governance, what are security, what is the cyberspace, what is SGP, what are some of the main differences between ISO 27001 and ISO 27002. We looked at the role of NIST, and we looked at the SANS Top 20. So that is all for this chapter. Thank you. So this concludes our lecture review on this book. Questions, concerns, or thoughts, leave a comment, make a statement, get a hold of me. If you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. Remember that when we do some of this, it is critical that we ensure that we're answering your questions. Don't just listen and don't try to apply. Listen, try to apply what we've been discussing, and when possible, if you're not understanding something, say something.